I'm viewing Emily's screen. So we'll give it just a short break here, or just a short time for people to log on, Emily, and then we'll get into it here. This takes just a minute. So we'll go ahead and get started. Very, very appreciative of those of you that have logged on again tonight. Know that many of you that have logged on have been on here before, and our stock show classrooms only continue to gain and gross popularity. And we hope that that's because it's somewhat entertaining, but that you get the opportunity to really hone in on some skills that you've wanted to for maybe many years, or you're just getting started, whether it be showing or whether it be feeding, just the general care and management of these projects. And so very excited to be able to talk tonight about show cattle showmanship, something that we don't hit just as much as probably we should. But the things that we like to talk about within Show-Rite is way more than feed. We believe that the opportunity to get your animal shown, presented, and work with it every day is a big part of show animals and being successful. And so we want to let you folks know that as customers of ours, or even not, this is something that we focus a tremendous amount on, is things like we're going to talk about here tonight. And, it's just like we always talk. I mean, many of you, I'm sure, that are logged on have been to clinics that I've had, or Dave Geyer, or Maury, or, anybody across the nation that we have covering those areas. And we always talk about general care management, and we talk just a little bit about feed. But tonight we get the opportunity to talk with someone that has an absolute love and passion for the cattle industry, and a great friend of mine, and has been one of the most successful showmen whenever she was showing of anybody across the country. For those of you that are logged on tonight that don't know me, I'm Miles Tenius, just like it says on my screen, if you can see it. And I'm a national support specialist for Show-Rite Feeds. Used to just kind of maybe cover just a little bit of the Midwest, and still do, but it's really branched out across the country, and absolutely excited to be on here again, like I said, with Emily tonight. Emily's from Kendallville, Indiana. She spent a tremendous amount of time on her family's operation, raising multiple breeds of cattle and being extremely successful, as you can see in the background here of her screen, if you get to see that. Many banners just hanging right there, and that's just a few of the ones that they've hung here, and even the last 3 or 4 years, particularly as we talk about the last 10, 15, 20. And so Emily, like I said, she's going to really kind of host your showmanship deal tonight. She went through here, and she found the things that needed changed whenever I had started putting together this webinar. And that is exactly Emily Griffiths, to straight to the point and be as good as you can possibly be. And so we're jacked up to have, I call her 3G, but Emily on here tonight to be able to talk to us. Emily, I would love if you could, and I know our panel, the folks that are on here, the participants, would love to know just a little bit more about you and your operation and what you do. So if you would just kind of give us just a brief background, and we'll get into our segment.
Yeah, absolutely, Miles. Certainly, glad to be here and have the opportunity to participate in this particular event. I think this is just such a great series, literally and figuratively, building these livestock from the ground up, from selection to nutrition to animal health, to really kind of putting all the components together. And now as we think about, I know you had some kind of breaking and some exercise species specific things, and now dialing into showmanship. So I think just a great opportunity and avenue. And there's so many ways that young people and parents and those that are enthusiastic about this deal can now really, watch the game tape and do their homework. So just another resource. But so appreciate the opportunity, Miles. And yeah, as Miles said, to know me is to love me, kind of taken over in terms of this particular presentation tonight. But so thankful and honored to have the opportunity, the invitation. From 3G Ranch co-owner and operator. Been in the livestock business, specifically the beef cattle business and industry, my entire life. Production is literally in my roots and in the ground I grew up on. And we maybe do things just a little bit different than some of the audience out there, just in terms of our perspective and as an operation, what we're trying to do. But right now we're at about 200 head of primarily limousines and Gelfies and some Angus cattle, primarily a seed stock operation. We mostly market our purebred bulls and females to commercial cattlemen. We have a great cooperative partnership with Wolf Limousine in Morris, Minnesota. So that's the avenue and conduit for those limousine bulls, and they market well-led cattle right now. So that's been great for us, and that's about a 20-year cooperative partnership. But we always have extensively used the show ring as a marketing tool. So that's kind of been the way that, you know, we can get out and we can advertise our breeding program. We don't necessarily breed show cattle, but we still show and showcase our breeding program. So showing it is instrumentally important to us and for us. The part of the world that we're in, Miles is too kind. Yes, I had the opportunity to experience some success, but part of that is also to rise to the occasion. We're kind of in the mecca of showing livestock of all species. So that kind of makes you better, makes you have to rise to that occasion, regardless of the kind of livestock or even the breed, specifically to cattle that you may be showing. So really had a great opportunity to kind of hone my skills and be competitive. You know, showed at junior nationals, regional shows, and we still continue to show and exhibit our cattle at the majors on an open level, and have had the opportunity to experience a little success. But you know, that showmanship aspect we really see as a marketing tool. So that's kind of, I think, as it specifically relates to the topic tonight, how that kind of fits in.
Now, I just want to say real quick, because she doesn't brag on herself enough. Obviously, her family's hung many banners and have a production setting, but Emily has been named the champion showman in 5 different breeds in a junior national heifer setting. And so, obviously, if many of you that have logged on tonight have ever been to a junior national, it is the Mecca, it is the Super Bowl, and it is the big one. And so, I don't know that any other person across this nation could say that they've ever done that, but that's absolutely incredible, and that's why we have what we feel is the best here tonight to be able to talk to you.
Appreciate that, Miles.
Yeah, we can roll.
Okay. Well, just a little bit so we kind of don't misrepresent what we're talking about tonight. Noah mentioned cattle showmanship and some exercise, and obviously maybe we don't get into the breadth and maybe the complication of some of the exercise of some of our other species. And as we all know, if we're out there ranching cattle, working on our projects, we know all intents and purposes, cattle are still, you know, really the last outdoor production protein species as we think about some of the other protein competitors, if you will. So they kind of have the opportunity for some self-exercise. But with that being said, you know, I think a setup and arrangement in terms of managing these cattle, even if, you know, we're bringing them in, maybe shutting them into some shade, to some fan, to some cooler conditions, obviously in the evenings, to have that ample pen space to move about and, you know, do some of those things that they can encourage some of that natural movement. And just popped in a picture. These are actually our calving runs, though we don't necessarily have a show set up, but it represents kind of what I'm talking about. And just, you know, rather than throwing that flake of hay right outside the door in the evenings, you know, take it to the other side of the pen, make those cattle walk. We have people probably from all parts of the country. If you've ever been in those feedlots, they have the feed bunk at one end and the water tank on the other, and that's for a reason, so those cattle can kind of get out and exercise themselves. Maybe if you have a little bit more kind of limited confines, obviously some of that, you know, managed forced exercise may be a little necessary if you don't have the pen space, but you know, it's so critically important, especially as large as these animals are relative to some of the other ones that, you know, may have some kind of mechanical and some more intricate type of exercise methodology. Just make sure, they're getting out and moving. I think I've heard, I think 1 to 2 miles is about what the average cow walks a day. So get them out and give them plenty of space. And even though we may, like I said, shut them up a little tighter during the day, just as long as they have kind of that room to move about. At a show, obviously, get them out morning, evening. I don't have a preference, but make sure you're getting them walked, getting them some exercise. That's just good to keep their comfort, keep their appetite up, make them a little bit more passive too, just in terms of a management and as it relates to showmanship. So just some things from exercise. Like I said, it doesn't get as involved, as intricate, maybe as some of the other species, but it's important that they have the access and the opportunity to that. You have anything to add to that, Miles?
No, I was going to ask you, so, if some of these families that are listening have, say, a run like you do, and their cattle go out and they're going to move their hay bale down to the end and have their water on this end, or vice versa, or they're going to start feed maybe on that other side. I think that's great that you just brought that point up, and it's something that we don't even think about, and how this actually relates to showmanship is getting these cattle their exercise so they stay together as you show them. But in terms of the showmanship, and you may even get into it a little bit, these runs right here, Emily, would you take those cattle after you're done working on them? Would you suggest that these kids take those cattle off of wherever they're working, however they have them tied up, and walk them to that pen and then let them free? Or, just to have some kind of be able to maintain those cattle, or have some kind of direction for the cattle?
Yeah, I mean, that's great. If time and opportunity allows, that would be ideal. I can tell you in that particular situation, you need to bust out your gumboots to get through that mud there. But yes, if a young person, can do that and lead them to the end of that run, and it's just one more opportunity to work with them, and just one more opportunity to work on something as simple as leading and making sure they get to the other end. And that's vital. And I'm sure you can reiterate that, just to get some forage in them. Let's say if you do have that hay, or obviously water, if it is at the other end of that run. And you can kind of watch them. Hopefully you're paying attention, whether it's just for general health, how they're naturally carrying their head, their eyes, their ears. You're just watching them a little bit when you turn them out. Heifers, if you're trying to catch heat on them, particularly this time of year. But hopefully you're spending a little bit of time, as you're cleaning up your barn and how they're moving about that pen. And, you can kind of monitor it in some of those things. A lot of them, will go eat hay. They'll come up and drink water, go back out, maybe themselves around that pen just in the evening, kind of as you're wrapping things up. So, but yeah, if you can lead cattle anywhere you want to lead them, one more opportunity to exercise, kind of become one with them. So yeah, I think that's a really good point, and certainly wouldn't hurt as a recommendation.
Awesome.
Yeah. So kind of just as we move through, I've got the title kind of Showmanship 101, and maybe this is just kind of as I approach anything, kind of have a philosophy, a goal in mind, something to aspire to. I don't think is a bad thing. And we're going to talk a lot about some of the individual finite metrics, some of the things that showmen do, the expectation in the ring, all of those kind of teachable moments. So it's kind of ironic, maybe, that I open this up by saying that a good showman, the difference between a great showman and a good showman is the really great ones are good stockmen first. And the hard part about that is we think about trying to teach showmanship, is that something that's truly learned. It's experienced over time, and you can see some of those young people that they just have that comfort, that familiarity with not just their animal, but livestock, and cattle, obviously specifically here, how they react, what they're going to do, and you can kind of think before that animal that you're working with, or even the ones in the rest of the ring, what they're going to do, but before they even do it. So, and that's not to say that a good showman can't be taught, learn those metrics, go in and really maximize the potential of an animal in the ring. But it's really meant to be kind of aspirational, to continue to learn, to understand cattle, livestock on a bigger level. Certainly it's about leading. It's about how to hold your hand, how the halter should fit, whether we're profiling them front view, rear view, but just also having a basic understanding of animal behavior, and that translates into not just, can you sort cows better if you the point is, but you can also know if something's going to spook them or happens to yours or another one in the ring, is where that, let's say, accident coming from going to make them go forward, going to make them pull back. You can anticipate that, and you can kind of even feel just reactions that cattle have. So that's something that you continue to learn over time, and we can teach all these things and try to give, examples and possible scenarios, but some of those things are just continually learned over time. So again, that statement's not meant to dishearten, but just really to be positive, and that you can continue to learn. And if a judge doesn't like how you hold your stick, that's not really the teachable moment. It should be everything else that happened in that ring or at that show. So kind of that next piece, and to lead into that again, I kind of have maybe a different perspective, as I mentioned, just in terms of how I was growing up. Obviously, I showed a lot of cattle and went a lot of places showing those cattle, but I maybe have a little different experience than some that are watching, or at least the majority. I can vividly remember the first animal that I showed, and not better or worse, just different, like I said, than a lot of people, but it wasn't a miniature Hereford. It wasn't a bucket calf. It wasn't a prospect steer. It wasn't a Hereford steer. Had a few of those. Be still my heart, still my favorite. But it was at the Michigan Beef Expo. I was 5 years old. It was a yearling bull. My parents sent me in, and it wasn't have a good time. It was, okay, Emily, how you show this bull and how he does is going to determine the sale order, and that is literally going to make or break us. Probably a few $1,000s. So that was my experience. And then I got to show junior cattle once I was of age, and it was just kind of the add-on. Yet if we took a couple consignment cattle to an expo, I got to take a few junior cattle. So I didn't even know that was work. It was just kind of a nice reward. But with that being said, is showmanship it shouldn't be the most important thing. It should be one of the important things. That's kind of that exclamation mark on your sentence or on a body of work. All these workshops do such a great job of building, and that's exactly what any good project or bigger picture, any good program is it's all those components. As my mom says, it's not the hat, it's the bow on the hat. And showmanship kind of adds to that. It's that final piece of the puzzle. You can spend a lot of time and a lot of work, and for some people it's generational. It's 5 generations deep of the bred known cattle that I showed, and that day in, day out, doing all those animal husbandry, animal care, proper nutrition, building on that, but then placing that final piece in that big picture of that puzzle is then the way that you get them presented kind of at that final point. So it's really about showcasing the animal, and there's lots of different ways to go about it in terms of your personal style and demeanor, but ultimately that goal, and I'm sure it's been said 1,000 different ways and time again, but it's really ultimately about the animal and getting that animal presented to the best of their potential using your best ability. And then that kind of leads into that final, you never get a second chance to make a first impression. And certainly that means on the surface, your confidence, your poise, your demeanor. But again, it's that breadth of understanding in terms of all of those pieces that put together showmanship. Yes, it's that confidence when you enter the ring, doing lots of all those things right, getting the feet placed correctly, making sure that those cattle are right in line, using good spacing. You understand the flow of a ring, how things work. You can do some of those little extras to make you competitive. But it's really just that confidence, that poise, that when you walk in the ring, you've been there before. You're going to certainly do everything you can while you're in the ring now, and you plan on being back for your division, for your grand drive. And that alone can be the difference. And to your earlier point, Miles, I think, all of these, it doesn't matter whether it's the county fairs anymore, all the way to our national shows. This in every single species is so competitive, is so tough. And regardless of the age, you can have similar age exhibitors And if one comes in with a really good calf that's well fit, well fed, well presented, and they do all those things like, I know I got a good one and I'm going to do the best job I can to show them. And if everything else is the same and that exhibitor comes in and they just don't really understand what they have or understand what's going on, again, those kind of things can really make the difference. And obviously in showmanship, but even in the confirmation shows. So just a few of those things. And I don't know if any questions have popped up or if you have anything to add, Miles.
Yeah, no, I've just been answering some questions as you go. And honestly, I've went through here and a few of the questions I know that you're probably going to cover. So I actually have asked them, if I forget about it, to ask you to bring that back up. So we've just had some exercise questions and things. And I really think, as you continue to go into it, it'll make very much sense to them and what we're supposed to do. But I've answered a few of them so far, and we're going very, very good. So hopefully you guys are understanding and where Emily's standpoint is and just how important that the showmanship is to her. And so as we continue, I'm excited to see what she's got to say.
Okay, so certainly there's some of those starting at home, and there's a pretty large majority of things that can and certainly should be done at home to do that work ahead of time. Obviously, we talk about that final piece of the puzzle at showmanship, at what goes on at the actual, but day in and day out, we can do a lot of things to take some of those variables out. Obviously, just working, being around, having an understanding of those cattle and the person that's showing them, critically important, and those things can be done every day. Especially again, how I grew up, because we would take 12 to a show and not 2. Some of the things that we really worked on, just that manners, that patience, frankly, that respect. That I think we should expect of those cattle to have to these exhibitors, and especially as we talk about a proportion of a young person that weighs maybe the same as that bag of Show-Rite feed compared to that 1,200-pound steer. There's quite a bit of variation. So I'd hope that we could teach that steer to have a little respect, to work with that exhibitor a little bit. I know I grew up in a breed that was our day in and day out struggle, was making sure they stayed out of your personal bubble. But those are the things that absolutely should be taught at home, and I'm sure there's some different schooling things and some of those things that can be done, but any of those things should absolutely be done at home and not brought to a show. Just again, as we think about bigger industry perspective, everything that we do, we are under a microscope when we go out in the public at any of these events, and we just always have to be the best ambassadors, not just for the show ring, but the fact that we're the people putting the beef on America's dinner table. So we always have to have that as a perspective. I've gotten the question when I've worked kind of in a different job, but at the state fairs of, why are they poking? Why are they injuring their feet with a show stick? Most of us wouldn't even think about that as a cause of concern, but that's what our beef eating consumers are kind of thinking about. So any of those kind of things, and I'm not even advocating that, but any of those things, absolutely done at home. And I, as far as practicing, it's all things. It's certainly teaching them to lead. It's working with them, making sure, again, they just have that respect, that understanding for the halter. They're not taking their head, even just tying them up. I think that's critically important, and obviously not their head too high, just kind of at a natural, comfortable level that they're not going to lay down, but just having them spend some time tied up. Just really teaches that patience. Obviously, if hopefully you have time to get out and stand with them in the yard, and again, just take some time just standing, just settling in. And again, that's just going to increase that comfort level. Practice obviously with the stick at home. Some of those things go unsaid, and then just a little bit of an understanding just about how the ring works. Those are great to do at home. If you have siblings or other cattle, or even parents can get other cattle out and just kind of practice that. And we'll go over some of those kind of metrics of some ring flow things, but just doing some of that kind of preparatory work at home. And expose those cattle to every variable possible, any and all of those. I showed hogs all 10 years of 4-H, and I can tell you absolutely without a doubt, every year my cattle were obviously way more scared of those pigs than the pigs were of the cattle. So that's just something to think about. You know, if you got a hog, do a drive-by so your show calves can see them. You know, make sure they've drank out of a bucket. Maybe you have an automatic water, but make sure you give them a bucket to drink out of, and just practice some of those things that that you may not think about, but you can't plan for everything. But some of those things you can kind of settle them, ease them into. Another thing that maybe gets overlooked, I think, is give the opportunity to have those cattle be separated, if you can, in some different pens, maybe where they can't see each other. And obviously that's going to make them just frankly more comfortable being alone. I see a lot of that of cattle that get their buddy, and you know, they can be great at home when they can see in that next pen their buddy calf, or you know, he's within balling distance, but you get them in a show ring and they just absolutely won't work for you. So just another small thing, try to take any of those kind of question marks out of it. Obviously a lot more is going to arise there when you get to a show, but you can try to adapt and overcome to some of those things in advance. And this is just a really good opportunity, you know, to work with your animal. And we'll talk about some of those things, you know, profiling, feet placement, you know, ring flow, pulling into a profile. We'll talk about those kind of the things to practice at home. Certainly practice those, but also just become familiar with the attitude of your calf, maybe what their preferences are in terms of how to be managed or how to be worked with, or what they'll tolerate out of you, or just being trying to put together in general. And then obviously confirmation of your animal. We'll continue to talk about that. But, you know, strengths, weaknesses, and those may change, you know, as you continue to study those cattle, they probably will change throughout the duration of that project. So that's a really good time to just get comfortable with what you can improve in them, maybe how they're changing, and again, just how you can adapt and overcome using some of the things that we'll talk about a little bit later. That's kind of, I guess, some of those things at home. And obviously there's a lot broader discussions that we can get into, you know, about different types of halter breaking procedures, you know, some of those kind of minutia, they're critically important, but you know, you can, and you may, I think you have in some of the other species, I'm not sure about the cattle, but you could spend a whole workshop on that alone. But kind of just that overview, maybe some of those things that don't get talked about quite as much in terms of some of that work that can be done while you're still at home.
So Emily, I got a couple questions here. Actually, they're blowing up. I don't know if you can see the Q&A, but you're blowing it up, and I can't even quite keep up. But are you, is there a point where, or would now be a time? I mean, we're getting quite a few questions on these cattle that pull the halter, and they're pulling back quite a bit. You know, is that something that you want to discuss now? Do you want to discuss it later? You know, or you good now with it? I mean, we've gotten 3 or 4 of those questions for sure.
Yeah, and I think, you know, as far as quote unquote teaching them to lead, obviously that's just something that's incredibly, you know, just repetitive in terms of the act of doing it. Obviously, you know, make sure you have help. That's the worst thing you can do is try to continue to drag those cattle. You know, make sure you get somebody else behind them, helping you out. And, you know, cattle aren't going to lead perfectly all the time, but, you know, get them to a point where they can kind of yield to that halter and just do some of that forward motion on their own. But that's the best thing I can say. Just make sure you have help. Make sure you have somebody that can get behind them. Something that we really place an importance on when we're halter breaking them is that we always give when they give. So once those cattle come ahead, give them a minute. Let them have that little reward, that little halter, that pressure being taken off their head, and then try again. You know, that just constant pulling. Expect them to get from point A to point B without giving them some breaks in between isn't always realistic, especially at the beginning. And you know, that halter, and we'll talk about that a little bit more, but it is really a critical tool, and that's your control. That's what they yield to. That's what they understand. That's how you communicate with them. So I think that's a really good way, and sometimes that gets overlooked. Of again, make sure you have somebody behind them, but when they come a little, even if it's one that you're really struggling with a few steps, ease off that halter, let them have a break, think, I got rewarded. essentially for good behavior. So that's just a small thing. You know, there's lots of different, you know, in terms of teaching them to lead and ways that's best to start that. But again, I think just giving them a little bit of time, giving them some reward when they do literally forward progress is, I think it is positive there. Like I said, we could spend a long time on just the various ways that you could base level halter break one, and that may be a good topic. But that's the thing I think best kind of summarize that. Does that answer, you think, kind of the questions, Miles?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, like I said, I don't, you know, where you'll continue to go through in a few of these slides, and so I don't want to maybe just break into anything that I don't need to yet. But you know, and if I do ask you a question, just tell me that we'll go. You know, we'll be addressing that soon. But you know, we did have a lot of those, and we're going to have some that we're talking about these steers or heifers or what have you, you know, and what kind of halter, what halter looks like, when do we go to a show halter, those types of things. And so, you know, as we look at this slide, I guess my take home point, or my take home message, excuse me, to me from Emily is showmanship starts at home. And I don't know how critical that particular statement is. That's just a slide opener, but that's a statement. If you want to be good at showmanship, you have to do it a lot. We've had a lot of questions, Emily, honestly, and folks have asked, when do you start exercising? When do you start breaking? And, you know, I would tell you that if you're going to continue to show into this summer and your fairs in a June, July, or August, you might potentially be a little behind the rest of them. And so, you know, it's time to get them out for sure. And, you know, we have a wide variety of you that are on here and listening. So make sure that you do get on and you ask any questions that you may have, no matter the season that you're in terms of experience.
Yeah, I mean, you know, absolutely. In an ideal world, and again, it starts at home. So as you know, soon as you can start doing just some of those small things, whether it's teaching them to lead, you know, teaching them to tie up, down, just some of those small things as early as possible, and then obviously kind of easing in. But the sooner you begin, the more time that you have to spend kind of at each of those sections. Because like anybody, we don't learn everything that we're supposed to know by the time we graduate all in 1 year. Obviously, it's quite a bit. At the bovine show timeline is pretty condensed down, but piecemeal, a little bit at a time. You know, that leading, that just understanding of respect, of being tied, of just being around people, kind of in an unnatural setting, not just working them out in the cow lot. Take that, give that its due time. And then start in with the show stick, with moving some of those feet. And again, as you continue to progress through the project, you'll be able to read those cattle and have a little bit better understanding. You know, I don't know, Miles, but I can see the question popping up. How exactly long do you spend? How many days do you spend leading them? How many days do you spend working on them with the stick? It's really just, again, kind of responsive to that particular animal once they're comfortable with it. But the earlier you start, the more time you have to give to kind of each of those stages in progression of getting them broke. So yeah, kind of as we'll kind of move through this. First of all, obviously a couple important showmanship tools, and these two, it's kind of a good segue because we commented on a few of these in terms of starting on these things at home. Obviously, neither of these things do you want to unload from the trailer and break out right when you get to the first show. Hopefully, you've had some time to settle them in and get some comfort level there. The halter is something that, and we'll talk about it a little bit later, but it is probably, some people may say it's the show stick, but that halter is really an integral tool in exhibiting those cattle. And that's in terms of the fit, the comfort, the practicality. I see that maybe hinders just in general an exhibitor's ability, or there's kind of that unknown of why isn't an animal maybe cooperating like they did when I practiced with them, is how that halter fits. And you can see a couple examples there that that top heifer, it's kind of lopsided there, probably because it's a little big, especially on this one side, and then opposed to that heifer there, that darker red one that's at the bottom right, that halter fits a little bit better. That halter should fit, and hopefully, on a daily basis, that rope halter that you're working them with, you can kind of see that divot in their nose, kind of where that natural right place for a halter to sit. Their show halter should sit there too. So I usually say about 2 fingers under the bridge of their nose, 2 fingers under their eye. That's not an exact science, but it's a pretty good rule of thumb if you're really questioning, exact lengths and you want to get in the weeds on that. But the farther and more comfortable a halter is up on the face of that animal, and that's true of whether we're talking about a leather halter, a cable halter, a rope halter, it's going to be more comfortable. Lots of times if cattle won't respond, particularly going back to the leading question, if they're not leading well, that may be the first place I might look in terms of how's that halter fitting. The farther it goes down there on the nose of those livestock, the more it's going to pinch off their nose. They're going to want to fight, pull back. That's not natural, again, because that's making them want to pull back. That's making them want to not go forward, pull back from the halter. So the better that halter fits of any kind, whether it's your just everyday halter or your show halter, the better that animal's going to respond. And I realize there's lots of different kinds of halters that we have as options now for exhibitors to use. I don't have a preference. It's whatever works for you. I'm a little bit old school, but I think just whatever the cattle have the most comfort with, obviously whatever you've practiced them with, and that should be done at home. I don't think that there's a certain amount of time or number of times you have to have a halter on them. If it's fitting properly, it's just going to take a time or two for them to get accustomed to that at the most. Again, do it at home. I'm going to let you in on a secret. I don't think in the last 10 years we've ever put a show halter on anything we've showed at home. So I'm not advising that, but I'm just saying that, a good fitting halter, we also wrap the chain or have a neoprene wrapped chain underneath the chin. Not only is that a little bit more comfortable, a little bit more similar to the rope halter that they are used to, but it's also going to be more comfortable for an exhibitor to hold as well, at least in my preference. If you have a different way, if you prefer to just hold the chain, I think a wrapped chain or a wrapped halter where you're holding on it with your hands, and we'll see a few pictures later, I think makes it just a little bit easier to work with. Just a couple tips and tricks, I guess. As far as a show halter, obviously they're expensive. This is a resource capital intensive project, which is your best friend. That's going to give you some play in a halter, especially throw that in your show box. If you need to add maybe a hold down low, if your steer's gotten a little bit bigger than you thought, hopefully you've tried that halter on him at home beforehand, but if not, you can obviously fit that to him, take it off, make sure you get another hole punch just with a leather punch. You can get them at a local farm store. And for a lot of these projects, that's going to give you enough play for the duration of the lifetime that you're kind of showing that calf from, whatever, a 4 or 5 weight all the way to finished weight. So, and also another thing I see a lot of, the straps on these show halters, they come pretty long. I think just from a safety standpoint, an ease of making those transitions with your hand, we'll talk about some of those things later, but make sure that strap's not on the ground. Obviously, we don't want that strap, that extra leather lead part to be wrapped around, an exhibitor's hand. We certainly don't want the exhibitor stepping on it. We don't want the calf stepping on it. So I know it's painstaking, right? You go to the supply trailer and you already have spent astronomical amount, and then on that show halter, you're going to take it back to the box and take out your pocket knife or maybe a safer tool, a set of kitchen shears or a pair of side cutters, but make sure that strap is the appropriate length. And I think the lowest common denominator is just make sure it's about the right length, that it's not dragging the ground for whatever the smallest animal that you're going to show. So a foot and a half, 2 foot of lead, enough to hold on to, if they want to get away from you, but not enough that it's going to drag on the ground. I know it's painstaking, but you can cut those off and shorten them up a little bit. Is there
Emily,
any
do
questions? And
you?
I know we'll talk a little bit
Oh,
about holding the halter and some of those things, but any questions specific to that, Miles?
you know, there's been quite a few, and I think you're answering them as you go. And if you are, I'm not. I usually don't round you back around, and I'll just type what you put, um, and we'll go from there. But we have some questions here. Could you use a rope halter as a show halter? Is that something?
I mean, certainly you could. I mean, it's not going to be, recommended. And that may be one of those special cases of if that's really what that animal is most comfortable with for whatever reason. Then I can see that maybe being an option. Obviously, that's personal preference. Just from a judge perspective, showmanship's one thing, and probably if there's that kind of attitude on a calf, it's probably not your die-in-the-wool showmanship calf. But just in a regular show, I guess to me personally, that's not going to make or break if I'm going to use one or not. I would suggest having a rope halter to show in if you're going to do that, where it may not be advisable if that's an absolute last resort. Obviously, we don't want whether or not you can what kind of halter you can show one with, decide if you're going to be able to show your project, but shorten up the rope on that halter. So again, it's about the length of a typical show halter. Make sure it's a pretty understated kind of nylon rope halter. But again, a last resort, I certainly don't think we should worry about a halter as opposed to whether or not that young person can perhaps show that calf. But it's an option. It's probably not high on the ideal list, but that's certainly an option.
Emily, I want to let you know that we have a lot of participants tonight, and we're going to have hundreds of them that'll literally log on the next few days and watch this, and it'll get up into that 600, 700, 800,000 people. But tonight, I've had the question more than once in here that if you judge in Canada, and so I know that you have, and I've answered that for you. But I just want to let you know, you've got all different folks, so different styles of showmanship and everything from across the nation listening at this point. So appreciate the Canada question so far.
Yeah, and I really appreciate the Canadians tuning in. If I just may take the liberty real quickly, I obviously love the States. I'm a U.S. citizen, but Canada is one of my favorite places to judge, and I'm so appreciative of really all the exhibitors in Canada. The cattle are incredible, and actually, fun fact, my first show that I ever judged, I was 18 years old. I was a freshman in junior college, and the Calves Association in Canada judged their national show at the farm. So that was the first show I ever had the opportunity to judge. So I'm eternally grateful for the Canadians. Judged the Canadian Hereford Junior Nationals, judged it at the Royal Winter Fair, at Farm Fair, had some pretty cool opportunities. So I do love my Canadians, and I'm glad that they're watching. So
Awesome.
just to kind of roll into, and hopefully we'll address, we have some more halter kind of discussion and we'll continue to, but also the show stick, great tool to get those feet set and just to correct some things, some top line placement, some levelness for some hooks to pin. So, and we'll talk about those things, but this is specific to kind of the size of the stick, the kind of the stick, but I think maybe one of the misnomers is the height of the stick should match the height of the showman. I think it's important that the stick match the job that the showman's trying to do. Certainly, it's easy to manage and manipulate a shorter stick, but thanks to all of those innovators, we have some pretty lightweight, extra large sticks now with that carbon fiber material that these kids can heft. And a kid showing a large size heifer, steer, whatever it may be, they're going to actually have a little bit more literal tool to work with in terms of set and feed if they need to. Again, that's something to work with at home. It needs to be a best fit to that exhibitor. But don't think that a smaller statured exhibitor, a younger exhibitor, can't start out with a longer, taller stick if that works better for them, because it actually let them stay a little bit more upright, that longer stick. We'll talk a lot about cause and effect, but that longer stick will allow them to stay a little bit more upright. They can maintain kind of that straightness of that animal's head without bending over as far. And, you know, the classic, they're trying to bend over and push that back foot, offside back foot back, and then they kind of pull the head around and pull them out of line. So just make sure that the length of the stick kind of matches the job, but most importantly, that it's comfortable and easy and efficient for the exhibitor to use. So just match the tool. That's something that's very highly personalized, subjective to what you like and what you like to use. So I don't think there should be any kind of what kind of stick. And we'll talk a little bit about, you know, holding your stick and some of those things.
Awesome.
Just as far as
Perfect.
matching it up. Yeah, so just to kind of roll in again, in terms of that halter, and you can kind of see actually the one on the far right, that halter is an example of that. One's a little bit far down, faintly Saintly's face there, but what these represent is kind of each a different style of holding that halter. One's when you're turned around there on the far left, setting them up kind of at that stand position, and then the other two are leading them. But that halter is really that control point on a particular animal. You know, you actually don't need a stick to get one showed, but that halter is something that you need. And that's where you can kind of, you know, turn ahead if you want to move a back foot, push back a little bit. If you want a foot to move back, kind of push back on that halter as you're pushing that foot back. So that's really the way, or that conduit, that you can communicate with that animal. And it's not just for, you know, moving feet and obviously getting their head, neck, and spine straight, but that's also that conduit that those cattle can tell if an exhibitor is nervous, if you know they're afraid, or if they're confident, poised, ready to go out and do work. That a lot of that gets channeled just through that lead strap. And so there, I think probably in terms of the highest majority of how people hold that halter at the stand, or so when, you know, you're turned around setting up that animal, or just standing still either side by side or head to tail. That chain, I think it looks the most natural, obviously, when that chain's coming out of the bottom of your hand, that ring or what's coming out by the face of the animals at the top of your hand, and then that strap's coming out of the bottom. Just a personal preference thing. I'm more of a thumbs down person, but again, it's just ultimately how you can get them showed and what your preference is. There's a couple different styles as far as when we ask those cattle to lead is, and you can see there in the middle, that's a little bit more the strap coming out of the top of your hand. I think if you're a little bit taller showman, maybe have a little bit more strength, that's a little bit easier there to manipulate that way. You can see we have a young exhibitor there on the far right. He actually has, again, that chain at the top of his hand, closest to the face, and then that strap coming out of the bottom. I'm sure some people have a preference on what's the best way to do things. To me, again, it's whatever makes the most sense and is of the greatest comfort to the exhibitor. Actually, shorter people, I think with that far right, it's just something to try. With that far right method, have a little bit more leverage, a little bit more control, because instead of trying to go over the top and lift the head of that animal up, they can actually get underneath and push it up. They can kind of get some leverage, you know, and I even have to do it as a big person with some of those age bulls, but you can kind of get that elbow close to your body and use some leverage and some force to push up on the head of that animal. Again, I personally don't have a preference. It's just a few options there as far as when you're turning around, asking them to lead there in the middle, and then on the far right of your screen, just some different ways to try it, because again, it's just about the kind of control that you have and what makes the most sense to you as an exhibitor. So any questions specific to that you're getting in, or just about?
As far as the halter goes, you know, we've had we've had several questions about the halters, and I'm so glad that, you brought up just the size of the halter and how important it is, because to me, just like you said briefly, the size and how the halter is placed on their face, on their head, really gives you the opportunity to control them in the ring, but it makes those cattle look better. I mean, whenever they're comfortable on the halter, their legs set better, their top line sets better, everything comes together better because they're comfortable. And so, that is something big. I mean, don't just go buy a show halter because it's shiny and looks cool. Buy one that fits and that you can utilize appropriately, and make sure that you do. And so I think Emily was right on kind of halter, where it comes from, all those types of things, black, brown, and different, yellow, pink. It doesn't matter. It's how you fit your cattle. And it's just one of those things that, you just really need to be honed in on and focused in making sure that happens. I know that we in particular, seems like the last few years, whenever we go to the ring, this is one of the last things that we think about is slapping the show halter on these cattle. And I do think, to me, if you're not utilizing it at home, then make sure that you put it on a little sooner than as you're going right to the ring. I do believe that there's something to say about that, in young showman's career in particular, because to me, it just offers the opportunity for these kids, for those calves especially, to have that around their head and not just get right into that big setting with people all around and, an unknown setting with a different halter. So, yeah, that is something to make sure you put it on there a little bit earlier. But, as far as everything else, we continue, Emily, to get cattle here, or questions on cattle that are stubborn and won't walk, and trying to just make sure that where they need to stand relative to where their hands and their halter and everything is. And so I'm sure you've covered it, or you'd like to now, go ahead. But those are some of the questions that we've had.
And I will say that that's a good point in terms of where the individual person stands that maybe I didn't mention. And again, a lot of these things, some of my horse background comes out, but sometimes I think people get the impression that they need to, if they're pulling or try to make that animal lead, they need to be ahead of that animal. Actually, the most comfortable really for both the exhibitor and the calf, and certainly you got to get them to lead, and or working on that reward system as far as giving them some slack when they do come ahead, but to really walk beside them. Not in front of them, because that's gonna do nothing but impede forward motion if you're always constantly trying to be ahead of them. But just to keep kind of at the side of those animals, kind of just in their eyesight where they can see you pretty parallel to where their head's at. Trying to always be in front of them, or even if you're pulling on them, if they won't lead, lots of times it's as simple as just taking a step back, having them kind of be at your same level and walking with them. And I know that makes it sound really simple, and I'm sure getting a lot of questions on how to lead and how to make them lead. I think people can find all kinds of devices and different opportunities to encourage or incentivize cattle to lead. That's up to your own discretion. But once you do get that forward momentum, be sure that again you're rewarding them. You got a halter that fits, that isn't impeding them wanting to lead and being comfortable to lead and walk with them. It should be a partnership. So just a few things that may help. Does that answer some of the questions, or at least maybe provide some guidance? Okay.
Absolutely. My fingers are wearing out typing.
Okay. So now a little bit, again, it's so hard to comprehensively talk about anything, but I think as far as just, views and angles that we get on these cattle, in terms of, feet placement always seems to be a question or a priority. I think that's incredibly important. But, just in terms of how we put the profile of one together. And I think a lot of people talk about, well, setting them up on the profile is just staggering their hind legs. It's, once again, a good showman it's really a lot more than that. All of those parts individually that we have listed there really work together to kind of paint that silhouette and that profile of an animal. And something we talk about a lot is I'll talk about the cattle. You know, I'll say that one's a little bit coarser shouldered or a little bit rounder out of his hip, and this is what we're going to do to fix that. It's not so much about being critical of an animal. I do that with my own, and these are all my own, so I can be critical of them. But you know, that's how you have to look at them, to know how you want to address and then how you want to put that kind of picture together. But everything correlates. We'll talk a little bit about leading and head carriage later, but you know, just as we start head to tail, just from a simplicity standpoint, in terms of putting one or setting one up on the profile, you know, I'm a pretty big proponent of just a pretty natural kind of head and neck set. You know, sometimes we get these necks too high. It actually shortens up what looks like the extension on those necks, or you know, too low can make them look a little bit plain or a little bit more common fronted. So just kind of a natural head carriage out of the shoulder of that animal. And then once we do move to the shoulder, you know, you need to know, is your calf a little bit bigger shouldered? Maybe tip them a little bit towards the outside of the ring. You know, it's all about perspective. So if a judge looks at him and there's a little bit farther away hip, obviously that shoulder is going to look a little bit smaller in relation to the hip of that animal. And then obviously, you know, in terms of those feet, those underpinnings, and I think I have a slide here next, kind of details that, you know, relatively straight in terms of obviously those front legs right up underneath that body. We don't want them too camped out. We don't want them too much up underneath themselves, that they'll look too far forward or too straight in their shoulder, and that kind of that back foot to kind of naturally drop out of the hip on that animal. I was having a conversation with a friend about that geometry is actually something that's kind of important that you learn in school that you can actually use later in life. So even selecting cattle is all about the angles, but just in thinking about how that makes sense in terms of putting them together, getting them stuck, those feet placement. So again, those staggered hind legs, and it's going to vary based on the animal. You know, I'm not going to tell you they all need to be this far apart or all these feet need to be placed exactly at the same perspective, because it's going to vary based on each of those individual cattle. But get that head set, that shoulder where it needs to be, work on getting those feet underneath them, and then also that top line too is an important part of putting them together. And lots of times that's cause and effect. You know, if you have those rear feet set naturally, correctly out of their body, you know, on a shorter hipped one, a hind leg close to the judge pushed a little bit farther back is going to make that calf look a little bit longer hipped. If one's plenty long and has a tendency to camp out, maybe starts to get a little weak top, you know, make sure you got those cattle collected up underneath themselves, put together, and again, work on getting that top line straight, getting that tail tucked. One thing that I do see is, you know, there's a critical importance placed on getting those feet set underneath that cattle, those cattle. And then obviously, you know, the infamous words of smile and get their head up, and we'll talk a little bit. A natural head carriage, you know, nose relatively normal. You just want that natural position, but then also work on getting that top line aligned. And again, it's going to vary based on that animal. I can't tell you that everyone's going to need loin, that everyone's going to need their belly picked up to get their top line up, or that everyone's even going to need their top touched, because that might not be the case. But, you know, we can do some things, whether it's, you know, loining one or right where those hook bones or those jump muscles are on an animal, which is about right there, you know, taking your stick, pushing that down. If one's naturally a little bit rounder, we'll look at a bull later that's he's a little bit more that way. This one was one, you can see me there. She also maybe had a little extra, but she also wanted to get a little weak top. So you can scratch in the middle of that belly and pick that top up. But it's really about the whole picture. Sometimes I think people talk about the profile and it's just about having those staggered hind legs, and it's a little bit more than that.
I'm like awkwardly holding my hand up like I have questions
Yes.
over here.
Yes.
But I have a couple of questions, and our viewers do as well. And one of the good questions is here: for a market steer or a breeding heifer, Do they stand the same? And do you stagger their back legs?
Yes, I mean, I'm a proponent of anything on the profile having that kind of staggered back leg, and again, I know that can be a personal preference thing. Yet again, I just think irregardless, that staggered hind leg, I mean, for all intents and purposes, it should serve the purpose that you can look at the udder, you can look at the flank line on that heifer. That makes common sense. But it also, we talked about, lengthens that hip, gives her just a little bit more femininity, irregardless of the amount of muscle that she has. But there's a logical purpose for that. And I think especially on these steers, maybe it's not as much staggered, maybe it's more. I think it's dependent on that particular animal, but just that foot back a little bit helps to elongate that muscle. And I guess the question that I'll pose back, and that's even now as I'm thinking about it, because I know people probably have a preference. I don't think I've ever seen a profile picture of a steer from a photographer that had one dialed in that had those back feet set up square behind. There's always that little bit of stagger, and that's a reason. Again, I think it lengthens and elongates that hip, makes them fit together a little bit better. Kind of that picturesque look, whether we're in the ring or in the backdrop.
Awesome.
Yep.
As you keep going,
now, as we talk about profiling and trying to, again, and that maybe goes back a little bit to teaching those cattle to lead, which is important, that they're responsive to that. But something that I think oftentimes maybe is hard to explain, but is important. We talked about that profile. So just that really collected, picturesque kind of look. Actually, that's most really easily accomplished when we ask these cattle to pull into their profile. And that's something that a lot of people say, but sometimes it's hard to explain. So I'll just go ahead and I will play this little video here. Hopefully that's playing for everybody. But what we're doing here is you can see, this is actually the only thing we had Halter broke. So this is a yearling bull we were showing, but and I can go through and play it again. But what I'm going to do is I'm leading that calf. I'm going to transition those hands, which certainly takes practice. But we're actually walking that calf or that bull a step or two and kind of watching until he sets himself up and he's doing some of the work essentially for us. And we'll talk a little bit about close is good enough, because this one was a little bit hard to work with. But again, just that few steps, letting that calf's kind of natural stride propel him into that profiled position. That's just something that's a lot easier for the exhibitor, and it's also more natural for the calf, because you're not fighting them. And it's really important for those, I think young people, it may be the hardest for them to learn, but it really makes showing, I think, really the most simple, because, to try to get those feet pushed back on one, obviously take some strength and some endurance, which they should have anyways. But, if they can really master that art of letting that calf do some of the work for them, using their forward momentum to essentially set themselves up, it's going to take a lot of that work out of it for you. And then, and again, that's just something that you have to continue to practice with and get comfortable with. It's about transitioning your hands, understanding how to, switch those hands as you're turning around, while simultaneously kind of watching for that animal to hit that profile. I think you can see in this video too, I'm making sure I'm not running into the trees too that we have planted there. So obviously there's a lot going on, but that's going to make it a lot more simple for an exhibitor than just stopping that forward motion, turning around, and perhaps having a calf that's now, wrong side profiled, feet way far apart. Just their natural stride, they profile themselves kind of as you watch that video. Each time you can see that. It's just about stopping, getting that animal stopped relative to where they need to be in line, and kind of setting themselves up. And this is, I think, also something. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead. Is there any questions or on that in particular?
No, what I was just going to add is, I mean, it may on some of their screens break up just a little bit. The video might chop just a little. And so if you do see her as she turns around and she basically walks that calf into a stop and a stand, you know, that makes it very comfortable for her, makes it very comfortable for the calf. It's always a forward motion and how she's doing it. And so she's got her to speed up there just a little bit, and you can kind of really tell what she's talking about. But I just wanted to point that out. I mean, she's not just turning around doing those things just because she wants to. That's to keep that calf cool, calm, collected, and comfortable. So you can continue.
And on that point, I mean, my videographers were only going to have so much patience, but you know, if I just stopped without that particular bull, you know, I think we can all see he wants to kind of duck and roll out of his hip, get a little up in his jump muscles, a little bit more underneath himself. So his natural inclination is to stop with no stagger, his front or his rear feet up underneath him. So if I were to just stop him and turn around, it's going to take a lot of effort and a lot of additional work to get him, which is pretty close, is again good enough here. And that is not perfect by any means. I understand that, but that's another thing too. It kind of can give you that close is good enough. You know, if you have a calf that just absolutely doesn't want to cooperate, you know, irregardless, pull them in that profile, but hopefully you can at least get that profile hit and get that good. We talk about that first impression, that good look of that calf, because they've already done a lot of the work for you, and you can stop, scratch him, get him calm, maybe ask for just a little extra. But that's something else that it takes time and work and an intimate knowledge of the animal to know when you can ask him for just a little bit more and when close is good enough. Because irregardless of the regular conformation show or showmanship, sometimes there is that dividing line of close is good enough. And you know, if you try to move that foot, although maybe you'd want to move it a little bit more, that calf's going to dance, not going to want to stand. You're going to be in a worse kind of shape than you were before you went to move that foot. So, and you know, there's no exact science on that. That's just a comfort, a feeling, yet again, an understanding and a knowledge of that animal on what you can ask them for and what you can't.
When do you prefer that they're switching hands? Is a question here that Jordan had. When you switch your hands, how early do you want to switch?
And I think it just depends on you know what kind of calf again that you have. You know, if you know you've got one that is going to be in a full stride and they're going to be set up versus one that may take a little bit longer. We'll talk about spacing a little bit later. That's also why it's important. You know, plan ahead, give yourself plenty of room, because it may take a couple steps. You know, you might want to only plan that you can hit it that first time, get them pulled in, and they're just going to be dead on. Or it may be a fact that you're going to have to walk them, you know, a cow length or 2 or 3. So just kind of, you know, gauge, give yourself a couple animal lengths before you turn around, transition that hand, you know, switch those hands so your leading hand goes to your show stick and vice versa, and kind of step back that cow length or 2 or however much you have room and space for to get them stuck appropriately. So that's just something that you kind of have to gauge. Plan on that it's going to take you a couple cow lengths, even if it only takes you one, and that way you just got plenty of room to work with.
Awesome.
Another thing that too I have on there, just prioritize what's important on your animal. You know, we talked about all those things, and it's a lot in a short amount of time. Head placement, tipping their head out, you know, making sure their pole's in line with the point of their shoulder, in line with their spine, that everything's straight. Also that, you know, you have those feet set appropriately, that you're getting their top line, you know, loining them, maybe tucking their tail. It's a lot to all do at once. And it's kind of a good example in this particular bull, and just as I was even kind of discussing what we'd like to change and show out of him, close is good enough there on his ground level foot placement, here to tell you it could be better. But my first inclination is once he was pulled into his profile and those feet were good enough, is to get that top line level, is to get those jump muscles down on that bull and fix his top. Because that's probably going to be the bigger glaring hole before somebody's going to look at his feet.
Perfect.
Just to kind of move through there. And I know there's some judges, it seems to kind of be a phase or a fad now that we're not putting these cattle in side by side, but irregardless, hopefully that judge is still looking at them from a front on or a rear view. And these cattle, hopefully their underpinnings or their feet and legs are kind of dropping pretty square outside their bodies. And one thing that I pretty consistently see, and again, makes the difference in, an exhibitor that can do a really good job showing a steer, or a really competitive showman, cattle put together, especially on their front ends. And that seems something, as we continue to push these cattle and they get more muscle, they also start to come apart a little bit in their shoulder. And that's going to come with weight and time, but something that sometimes I think may get overlooked that we can correct and work on. And you can see kind of the before and after of the two pictures there on the far left. That bull maybe a little bit wider in front than ideal, and that's a little bit the way that he wants to stand. You can kind of see there how his shoulders built. You can tell he's a little bit folded together, and that even makes there right where his forearm and even the point of his shoulder look like it blends a little bit, like he's a little bit more appropriately laid in right there at his shoulder. So those are some little things that we can fix, and that's what a judge is looking for there when they walk in front of those cattle. In a showmanship setting, certainly they're probably looking if you step aside or see if you can get a front view, but ideally, hopefully they're walking in front of those cattle to look at how they're laid in their shoulder, how their toes sit, kind of where those legs come out of their body. And that's true on the front or the rear view. We don't want them to get outside their skeletons. So here's a video kind of, and this is where it takes a little bit more manipulation and practice, but you can see using the foot, using the stick to kind of fold that leg back in on that bull. And that's something, again, not only does it give you the competitive advantage in the regular show, but again, a mark of kind of that next level, next caliber showman, going to be able to put those cattle together. You obviously can't use your foot as well, but similar things can hold true in terms of setting those rear legs, rather than just poking the front of the foot, maybe reach around and poke the back while kind of nudging that over with your stick. And again, that's just a learned skill, but keeping those cattle underneath themselves, just really important. And that's something too, as you continue to learn to pull into that profile, you can kind of do that all at once, but even just there, if it close is good enough and you want to add just an extra one to put that front end together, that's kind of a pretty simple way to do it. But again, something that just takes practice and some comfort to be able to do. Is there any questions specific to that, or maybe anything that's popped up?
No, I mean, honestly, as you continue, I mean, most of the questions that come through, you're answering just as they come through, you'll answer them right away. And so, we just have a couple questions, and you may get into it in a minute. Like, we've got a question here, and what's your best advice in teaching one to just hold still and set up? Is it tying their head up daily, in several hours, or maybe what's your recommendation? I know we're on foot placement right now, but I do think that probably sets right in there and getting their feet to place and just getting them to stand there and stay comfortable.
Yeah, and I think again, just time, we talked about that kind of respect, just understanding that whether they're tied or whether they have somebody on their halter, that we just expect them to be relatively well behaved, to have some manners, to stand there and kind of play along. I think it is impossible to expect that any animal is going to stand perfectly all the time. The more that you work with them, the more you're comfortable with them, the better that they're going to do. Again, exhibitor, stay calm. One thing that we didn't talk about, the show stick. In terms of scratching those animals, sometimes we can get a little fast-paced show stick, and I understand that that's often a direct tell of nerves. The more nervous a showman is, the faster that show stick's going to go. But you know, working with that animal, yes, standing, also kind of learning where they like to be scratched. You know, they may like scratched maybe farther ahead on their belly, maybe farther back. Maybe they like you to mix it up. Maybe they're brisket for a little bit, for a little while. But, you know, if you're standing for a long time, practicing at home, try those things, but also in the show ring as well, because those are just things that you're going to learn about that particular animal. But with that being said, and this is me, whether, again, my background, whether I'm judging showmanship or judging the regular show, even if those animals aren't standing perfectly, you know, the entire time, that's okay. You know, we don't, if, you know, we're getting in crunch time and, you know, you've been out there a long time. Maybe you're at that front of the lineup and you got a really good one. You know, you may need to walk them to freshen them up. And I know that's maybe getting in the weeds a little bit yet too, but certainly standing still, being a cooperative dance partner, but also working with however they're going to behave and act. But yes, working with them at home, just standing with them, scratching them, not asking them to do anything other than just stand there, keeping them tied up. I can remember it's the horse side, but again, in terms of standing for a long time, my mom, I can remember her telling me she knew how many stitches were in the show halter of her horse, because she stood for that long and counted them there on the halter of her horse. So again, spend as much time as you can, but you know, don't be frustrated. Not all is lost if they don't stand perfectly. And we'll talk a little bit about, you know, circling and spacing and some of those things later. But yeah, just work with them to get them to stand. And, you know, all those things that we talk about, keep them comfortable. If they're fed and watered and they've been exercised previously, you spent the time at home, a lot of those things are going to culminate into an animal. Just if you're purely worried about them standing still, it's going to do nothing but help that. But ultimately they're still an animal. They're not going to stand perfectly all the time, and just if you can kind of accept that, but to continue to work to make them better. So kind of as we move through, and again, I know that we're getting into some finite things, but as we talk about just those showmen that have an understanding, maybe don't. This is probably one of the things that I continue to see runs the age gamut, isn't just limited to junior exhibitors, but just in terms of, you know, maybe it's called the S curve, but in terms of how, you know, when you first enter the ring and those cattle start off side by side, whether you're first in line or in the middle of the line, you know, it's kind of important to know how this move and how this process works. And I know for some of you out there, this is old hat and this is redundant, but for the parents trying to teach or the young people paying attention, just kind of a good depiction. And yet again, like everything we do, it has a purpose. You know, we start with those cattle and they may enter the ring from a variety of different perspectives, but it is tradition and it can change based on the judge. But, you know, cattle come in and are stand side by side, as they say, and then they're asked to lead. And it's this motion called an S curve, and that can kind of be confusing to any exhibitor, young exhibitors, especially those starting out. But as you can kind of see and flow there by the arrows, but we're pulling those cattle, and you can kind of see the top of that S, and then walking behind the other animals in that lineup. And the idea of this is the judge gets a perspective of them walking as much as possible versus, you know, if you lead a calf out and walk it in front of those other animals, the judge isn't seeing those animals, isn't comparing them on the lead for as long as if they would have started with this S curve. So just a kind of a little pictorial representation. So again, just to kind of place it in terms of the flow of a ring. Obviously, those, you know, exhibitors may enter, whether it's from this side or this side, whatever. But oftentimes, those cattle, the first time they stop to be set up and stand, and the judge is inspecting them, is there where they're side by side, and then they're going to oftentimes ask you to lead without a lot of explanation. but the expectation is you kind of perform this movement. And there you see the top of the S. That's really also going to be the only time you're ever going to pull a calf towards you. All the rest of the time, you'll always want to be pushing that calf away. If you're circling, kind of as you see down here on the corners, you're always going to be pushing that calf away from you or away from your hand. So you want to be on the outside between the gate and the center, between the gate and your animal. You'll want to be closest to that outside of the ring, except for here when we start here at the top of the S curve. And it's kind of a finite detail, but I think it's nice to just put that in because I know I could never find a pictorial representation as I was kind of trying to teach young people throughout the years, and usually it ended up as a little sketch in the shavings, or worse yet, it just was, we'll just follow the one in front of you. So hopefully that gives a little bit better perspective. And again, we talk about everything has a purpose. That's just so the judge can see those cattle. You want to push closest to the back, basically the back end of those cattle that's safe, to give that judge a pretty far kind of vantage point. Those cattle walk. You don't want to be up on top of them, but then sweep around, and then they may walk a couple times, but ultimately we're ending up in that head to tail or that profile. So that first kind of picture that we talked about for those cattle head to tail. And something that I made just because I thought about in terms of mentioning in this particular section, I know a lot of people, there's some different, again, we talked about staggering those hind legs, and some people, you know, it seems like anymore never set an animal square. They're always on the profile. I think that there's a time and a place to, even in our breeding heifers and certainly in our steers, where they're side by side, kind of as you see here, where we're truly comparing the thickness behind and then the front end structure, the shoulder, the feet and leg placement off of either end. I think a relatively square set, there's still a time and a place for that. You know, if they're standing with a little bit of profile, a little bit of stagger, that's okay too. But I don't mind somebody that can differentiate, knowing that cattle side by side can still be set up square. And then to circle back to that earlier question on the profile, yes, we certainly want to stagger or profile those hind legs there where we're head to tail. Any questions on that, Miles, or anything to add? Or
No, and I think that, you know, you were just right on. I mean, as you look here, it seems so simple to some, but these motions that you're showing are very, very critical to get things to set up right and just to get them to move right. Everything that you're needing for that judge to really be able to look at you comparatively.
right, and you know, I think the best thing, again, you talk about practicing, it doesn't always have to be with an animal. As you're starting these young people, you know, lay a couple sticks to represent other cattle. Just take that young person and have them literally walk that pattern, so they understand before they ever, you know, have to worry about also dealing with an animal and learning this, because this is a really critical part. We talk about that kind of first impression. Young people, whether it's in the showmanship contest or just in the regular show, that have an understanding of this are just going to look like they're in that much more command of the situation. And they're also going to be a lot more comfortable and confident because they're not lost. When the judge asks them to lead or the ring steward tells them to lead, they're going to know exactly what that expectation is. So just and kind of in moving on, and this is, again, just something that I think oftentimes, and maybe if you want to talk about personal preference, this is something that we do, that I do, but again, I think cause and effect makes sense. So, you know, there's that saying of you know, when a parent sends a calf in a ring, of smile and keep their head up, as that's the most important thing, to keep their head up to a point, yes, but also it shouldn't impede the natural progression and gait of an animal. And a little bit to, actually a lot to circle back to getting those cattle to lead. You know, when just think about yourself. You know, if somebody has your chin up and expects you to walk down a sidewalk or down a path or out checking calves in the woods, someplace you've never been, and you can't see where you're going, you're going to be a little bit hesitant. You're not going to be as eager to just reach right out there and go forth if you can't see where you're going. And that may sound like an extreme thing, but you see some of these cattle that really have their heads up to a fault. Not only does it shorten their neck, they can't see where they're going. They're not as comfortable. And here's a video. It actually can change the structure and how what their natural carriage is on a particular animal. This video here that we have, you can see keeping his head up. You can even see I do have some help because he just wasn't wanting to lead. Kind of knuckles over, gets a little coarse in those jump muscles. We let that head relax. Let it be a little bit more natural. That bull's top levels out. He takes a fuller, quite a bit more sweeping stride, and he's way more keen to get out and walk. It's not about having their head drag on the ground, but just that natural kind of carriage is going to not only encourage them to walk, but structurally they're going to be more comfortable. And I understand that, you know, we're worried about just how sexy and sweet fronted these cattle are. You know, that's cool for them to have some fancy, but as a judge, and Miles can tell me differently if I'm way off base, but when we're asking these cattle to be put on the lead, I'm typically not looking at their head and neck. I'm looking at how their hip relates to their spine, and how they're moving underneath makes their top side carriage and lines like it is. What's making those cattle not comfortable? That head and neck is the last thing that I'm looking at. And if we can do something to not only get these cattle we talk about leading better, in my opinion, that helps them out immensely. But it also just, I think, helps make them a little bit more comfortable in their structure. They can see where they're going. Their head's at a little bit more natural carriage. It's a little bit more, we're just like pasture, and you see those cows motoring out across there. Unless maybe we got some disposition issues, most of the time it's just a pretty natural level kind of head carriage. So I'll play that for you again, because I know that's probably not that's not the popular opinion. But you can see there where we start. I even had to have a little bit more help, and this one's pretty short neck, so his head will only go up so high. But once we drop that head, not only does it make him look like he's freer in his shoulder, because he can take a longer stride up front, but also behind, he can have a little bit more reach, a little bit more drive underneath. We don't have that head lifted up, and it's not jamming up his spine and his jump muscles, but actually just making him relax a little bit. And again, that's something you can practice at home. You know, if hopefully you can see this, just have somebody else lead them, make some of those decisions on how your animal looks best. But this is just a case in point, and something we find pretty often in terms of just making cattle move a little bit better. There's obviously a lot of other additives and things that you can do, but in terms of just what you can do getting one showed, I think that always helps really insurmountably. Any questions on that, Miles, or anything that?
No, heck, I mean, you know, I think it's just about following the steps that you have there. As those folks listen on here, continue to follow the steps of where you're at. But no, I mean, the questions, we continue to get a lot of them, but it seems, like I said, you just answer them as we continue to go. So it's going great.
And again, to the earlier point too about pulling them into a profile, if they're taking a more natural stride, they're also going to set up a little bit more naturally as well. So rising tide lifts all ships, kind of in that situation. Okay, some other important details, and this certainly isn't just to summarize them and paraphrase them by saying they're not important by putting them all in one page, but just some things to discuss. Obviously, first and foremost, and whether it's at the beginning, you know, you talk about exercising, working on a day-to-day basis, but even then, once you get to a show, you know, be sure that you have a game plan. You know, if you're not familiar with the ring, or maybe how a judge may work the ring, go up and watch a couple of classes. You know, work with somebody that's helping you out, a parent, a sibling, if you're a younger exhibitor, to kind of have them explain, help you out about some of the things that they need to be thinking ahead, planning for, and to some point at every level, we're always working our plan in our head. It may be the difference for some of the younger, more experienced exhibitors that they have to go up, watch some classes, really review it. Or it may be just as simple as when they're a couple steps out, there's a hill I can find. I need that calf to be a little bit more uphill than down in that hole. And that's all happening as you're pulling them into that profile. But those are the kind of things to just have that plan for. How that ring works, how that judge is working that ring. And that's going to be incredibly important to alleviate lots of those, especially for the young exhibitors, in terms of before they ever get out there, whether it's in the showmanship contest or whether it's in the regular show. Because if they kind of have a plan for everything, they're hopefully will be a little bit more comfortable. Now, whether it all comes to fruition, hopefully it does, but they're a little bit more calm because you're not flying blind. Another thing I think that's important, and again, just shows that you have that understanding of how a ring works and what's expected of you, but is always to pull ahead when you're head to tail, when a calf pulls out in front of you. So it's kind of like the lunch line at school, right? If somebody slides their tray up, you're not just going to stand there. You're going to go ahead and fill in your hole so you can get your fruit salad, or you can get your chicken fritter, or whatever's next in the lunch line. But hopefully, a judge is paring down to pick between at the front end of that class. So, and again, everything has a reason. We're pulling ahead or filling in that hole as maybe one gets out to be placed or directed somewhere else in the ring, whether it's at the front or the end of the lineup. But that then you go ahead and pull in and fill that hole, because what the judge is trying to do is, whether it's to select for the top or the bottom end of that class, obviously they're trying to get them together so they can compare them more similarly. And again, that's just understanding kind of what's going on in the ring, and that kind of leads in there directly to the eye contact, which we'll talk about later. But always be sure that you pull up, fill in that hole. It's just the courtesy, respectful thing to do in the regular show, what you should do, and for a lot of judges is a make or break in terms of the showmanship contest. Anything, and I know we got a few more things to talk about on this slide, but anything that's come up or specific to that, Miles? I don't want to.
We've got no. You're doing great. I mean, they're all still here. I mean, everybody. A few questions, and we've got one. I've heard that when a judge walks in front of you, and the calf that you should blow on their head to bring their ears forward. Is this true?
Well, and I have that down here, and we can certainly jump to that too. But I think that ears up debate, in everything that you do, it's always about the calf. And obviously the showman has to be there to facilitate it, but the calf should always be the priority. You don't want to make a production of it. Here's the kind of do this station, not another. Certainly you don't want to be over the top. You don't want to be heard from the other end of the ring. In the regular show, again, especially when things are competitive, getting the calf's attention, if everything else is going right, getting them ears to flat forward is kind of that icing on the cake. But hopefully, it's a little noise under your breath. It's just talking to them a little bit that's going to get those ears forward. And again, it shouldn't be loud. I don't feel it should be overbearing. I think it's something that when the heat's really on, particularly in the regular placing confirmation show, can be the difference. Shouldn't be a production. Don't do it all the time, but it's something that should be a consideration. But kind of that last step, that finishing touch, once you have all the mechanics done. Now, in showmanship, actually, I'm as a participant and as a judge, I could probably leave it. But again, that's just a personal preference kind of thing. But at the same time, that's something I do. Actually, I'm more apt to not when the judge is right on top of them or looking at the front end. When that judge is center of the ring, making those final decisions, a little ear flat forward can give you that little bit extra look. I'm actually more apt when the judge is far away, and we talked about that profile or put that picture up earlier. That's when I'm really going to utilize that. It's not going to be an all the time thing. It's just going to be that crunch time when it really matters. I'd be a little leery of it in showmanship, just because again, you can sometimes cross that line of making it about attracting attention to yourself versus your animal. But again, that's going to be one of those preference things. And, you know, we'll talk a little bit about showmanship as a contest preference, but you know, something that should be used when it really counts and when it really matters. And if you know that your calf's going to respond to it and you've checked all the other boxes, and that's the last one to check. So as far as spacing and staying in line, you know, we talked about how pulling into your profile, giving yourself space, whether you're side by side or head to tail, you know, an appropriate amount of space, not so far apart that it's disrespectful. You know, a couple 2-3 feet behind that, you know, behind the calf that's in front of you, I think it is appropriate. Enough space in between cattle to be sure that you can look when cattle are side by side and you know, make sure they're set up and lean over to move a foot or do your business that way without impeding the one next to you, again, when you're in that side by side situation. But give yourself space to work with. You know, to that next point, if you do have to circle or you do need to pull that calf up one more time to hit that profile, you know, if cattle are in heat or again, a little bit of self-preservation, if one in front of you maybe isn't cooperating, maybe they're more apt to not respect the space that they have. Give yourself kind of that ample amount of space, but you don't want it to be too close, but you don't want it to be too far that again, you're kind of shorting some of the rest of the cattle that may be in the lineup behind you. Just enough room, kind of a safety zone, a buffer, give yourself a little bit of working room. And also staying in line, you know, to an extent, you want to be, once again, respectful as an exhibitor. It kind of goes to that sportsmanship at the end. You know, everybody can be a little bit guilty of maybe just being a little bit out of line, a little bit more towards the center of the ring. Problem is, when everybody starts doing that, we can start piling up. But ideally, you should be in line with that calf that started the line. So, you know, if you're side by side, your nose should be in a line with that one that's at the front of the line. And when you're head to tail, you know, you should be right in that same line as the one that's at the very, very front of that line, the first one that would have let out and the first one that would have stopped on the profile. So for all intents and purposes, they're kind of your guide. But again, just be respectful, be cognizant. You don't want to find yourself in a hole, but you don't also want to be obnoxiously too far out in the center of the ring either. Just kind of stay in line. Give yourself an advantage when it's appropriate, but also in a respectful way. As far as circling cattle, and that goes a little bit to just how, you know, standing still. To me, it's not a battle of wills. You know, it's not an automatic out for a showman if they have to circle one. Sometimes it's just getting better placement. You know, maybe if one behind you is you know, maybe a little bit too close and you have some room to work with. The main thing about that I will say that I think is critically important and is a do is, once again, always push those cattle away from you. So, you know, if you're head to tail, pull those cattle and circle towards the center of the ring. You always want to be pushing that calf away from you. That's just so they keep from stepping on you. You always want to push them away from you. You don't ever want to pull them or circle them into yourself. And I know too, side by side, sometimes there's some schools of thought too, just on, you know, do you go all the way around to the end of the line? I think it varies based on where you're at within that side by side line. If you do have to circle, because obviously that's a little bit more precarious than if we're head to tail, you don't have quite as much room pulling ahead. And if there's only a couple calves behind you, it may make more sense to just go ahead and pull forward, again, pushing out, circle around those last two and pull back into place. But if you're giving yourself ample room, not only next to the other calf that's beside you, but also in front of you, you can always pull that animal out ahead and then make a circle that way to pull back in to your lineup. So if necessary, that's the biggest key that I have, is just make sure that you're always circling them the right way. But if it's something that's necessary, go ahead and do it. Don't get stuck in a hole or a terrible setting or scenario. And that goes back to just getting one presented in our regular show. Showmanship, I know, has variation on what judges have the preference of, but ultimately when we're still showing those cattle, a judge isn't going to beat one if it's circled because it needed to, because it needed to set up, because it needed to take another shot at getting them pulled into a profile or getting that kind of image or silhouette that we talked about earlier. Eye contact should be eye contact should be with everything in the ring. Yes, the judge, you should know where they're at some key points. You should always check in with them. But the judge is not the only thing that you should be looking or staring at. There's a lot else going on in that ring as far as what's going on with the rest of the class. If there's other trouble animals, there's nothing worse than, unfortunately, another one way and aren't cognizant of what's going on around them and gets ran into by one that's loose because they didn't have a good perception of what was going on around them. So check in with that judge at some key times. When you come in the ring, obviously, if they're near you, analyzing your animal specifically, when they're placing you is a good time to be paying attention so you don't miss that pull. But it doesn't have to be, and it shouldn't be all about the judge. Know where they're at, kind of check in with them, but also check in with everything else that's going on in the ring. The other cattle, the spacing, if you're in the right line, and some of the other things that are going on. Any questions to some of those? And I know that's the really abbreviated version of some topics that can get really extensive, but anything specific to?
Honestly, I haven't. I mean, we've had some just questions where you're from, and I have had a few questions and I'll ask you later on, but if it would be okay if these kids contact you also at some other point and via Facebook or social media. And I'm sure that you're okay
yes,
with that, but we got some folks to look forward to. Great.
To alleviate some of that, and we can spend all night, but I know you can ruminate on this, and yeah, I'll always be available, but we can talk about that a little bit later. Sportsmanship, and yes, it's critically important to your other exhibitors to always be a good sport, and sometimes I know that's exponentially easier said than done. But really, just again, we talk about that impression that you make. It's sportsmanship in the mechanics that you do, but also in your demeanor and behavior. A few things as far as actual techniques, things to check off from a checklist perspective. We talked about spacing. That's just being appropriate, kind of maintaining that line, not getting too far out there. Having respect for the basic flow of the ring, and understanding some of those things. Sometimes we can get into some of these. You can watch some of these older exhibitors. They don't want covered up. They don't. So we're circling, and again, we're all to the center of the ring. Just maintain some sportsmanship. Another thing that I think is important, when a calf ahead of you, speaking of leading, won't lead in a show ring setting, go ahead and take that extra split second, put that stick in your hand, and go ahead and put your show stick in your hand that also has the halter, and go ahead and twist the tail on that calf in front of you. That's just, again, a respect for the animal, a respect for the fellow exhibitor. That's often to get them to lead at home. If they were leading to the wash rack, you wouldn't necessarily try to hit them with a show stick. You'd reach up, twist their tail. And again, that's something that's going to take some practice, some experience, especially for those young people, if they understand that if a calf isn't moving ahead of them, to go ahead and help that exhibitor out. And I know some judges don't want anybody to help in the ring, and it's all up to how they lead and other exhibitors to help them. So that's something to keep in mind, that you're always trying to help, because we talked earlier, rising tide lifts all ships. If you help get that calf ahead of you going, that's going to allow you to walk your calf like they should. You're not getting impeded. It keeps the ring flowing, and it's also just the appropriate, polite way to do it by, again, putting that stick in your halter hand, and reaching up and just using your hand rather than hitting them with the stick. I'm sure we've all seen when the sticks get caught in the tails because we couldn't be bothered to put the stick there in the strap hand. So some of just those kind of finite sportsmanship details, but then just bigger picture. Obviously, there's more than one show a year. If they were all supposed to be judged the same, we'd only have one show a year. And that also can really make a marked difference on a judge too. I can specifically remember a story that the late Ken Habiger always told about me whenever he would judge me later in life in showmanship, as he remembers, this will really date me, at the Premier Stockman in Columbia at the cattle show. I had a pretty nice heifer, and it was a complete class, and she happened to end up second after we spent a lot of time out there. But I made sure to stop as he was giving the critiques on that heifer before I exited the ring, and took time to listen to what he had to say and what he was saying, which is important. All exhibitors should do that, but if nothing else, just out of a respect. And that's something that stuck with him for a long time, and people will always remember that. You know, they may not necessarily remember the show you won. There's a certain segment that will, but a lot of them are going to remember how you act when you didn't win, or maybe when you didn't do as well as you did. And certainly you should do that just from a human element for your future exhibitors. But if for nothing else, you know, judges on a pure competitive basis, we've got a pretty good memory most of the time. So those are the kind of some of the things that stick with them. But and again, that's just overarching sportsmanship and in everything that you do. And again, sometimes I know it's easier done because you always want to give yourself the competitive advantage. But still, there's time for everybody to just have their due look and do their due diligence and to do your part to make a good showing. Any questions to any of those things, or anything that we need to add to some of those things?
No, I just had a question that probably goes back to a couple slides before. Setting front feet with your boots or show stick.
Yeah, and you know, I showed the video of me doing that, and again, maybe that's a little bit of a good segue there to the next slide. That's something that's really subjective, in my opinion, or in anybody's opinion. Again, just the regular getting one showed, confirmation show side of me says, you know, if you have that additional tool to utilize, you utilize it. If that helps you get to that final desired kind of an outcome. But I know that can vary based on a judge. You know, some judges don't ever they only want you to use, you know, your show stick and your halter, essentially. They don't want that foot up there for placement. Again, thinking about the confirmation show, a judge is not going to beat a calf confirmationally because a young person uses their boot to set a foot. That's some of those finite things in terms of showmanship, and that can really be to me the challenge. And you know, in a sport of what is already opinion, you know, everything, lots of other things, horse racing by and large, the fastest one wins, the most points at the end of a basketball game, when we could actually still have one of those. It's pretty easy to tell who the winners are. The regular confirmation show is already so objective and based on opinions and types and kinds, and then showmanship is really that next level. So that's something to keep in mind. You know, we can look at on that rear view a group of steers and say, you know, it makes fundamental sense that one that is a little thicker, a little wider, appears to have more muscle, is probably going to have a little bit more product. A heifer with a better shaped foot, probably going to have more longevity. But if a young person gets a top line set in, gets the feet right, it is absolutely personal preference. If they do that with a little bit more bend to their arm, or they're a little bit straighter on their arm, they stand a little straighter, maybe they lean over a little bit. Those are very much personal preferences relative to showmanship. You know, how you stand, if you use your boots, not going to impact the confirmation show, but those are some things that judges oftentimes have very specific preferences on it. And admittedly, that can be kind of the frustrating thing about showmanship. And, you know, to jump down a little bit to the available resources, just like this, you know, that any resource that you can use in any realm of trying to make yourself better. But, you know, Miles, I know you can agree, because we grew up in a time where when we were really showing ourselves as juniors, you know, we didn't have webcasts of everything. We didn't have near the extensive virtual workshops or classrooms like we do here. We didn't have social media and live videos and all kinds of companies really contributing to making people better, and having people who judge, giving their opinion and giving their preferences. You know, young people are in a great time now where, you know, you can watch game tape. You can watch somebody judge showmanship at some show and hear all the things that they talk about that are very specific to showmanship. So you can maybe make some of those tweaks if you're singularly worried about the showmanship contest and what they prefer, what they don't. You know, use those resources. I've talked about a few things tonight that are my personal preference. You know, the next showmanship I'm judging, somebody comes and watches this, which hopefully they are anyways, just for the content. But, you know, you have those kind of resources to really hone in on what the personal preference of a judge is. And that's why maybe we haven't really gotten into the weeds, if you will, on some things. They're important to the style and how you go about executing that. But, you know, how much bend you have in your arm, how far close that you stand to the head of that animal. If I'm seeing more of your side profile, or maybe you're tipped a little bit away from me, those are all very much personal preference things. You know, I've heard people, if you scratch, I only want an exhibitor to scratch him in the brisket. I only want them to scratch them in a belly. I want them to change where they're scratching them based on where I'm at on the animal. You know, if people, I've gotten the question, you know, if we're having them switch, do you walk them after you switch them? Do you keep your stick? Do you not? I'm not into questions. I'm not into switching cattle. So as a judge, I can't relate to that. But irregardless, what I may say or give advice may be completely different to that specific showmanship situation where a judge may have a preference. So I know that's a really long answer. It kind of leads in, but to that question, because I can imagine that there's, and maybe not, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but a few of those that are maybe some more of those preferential type things. So yeah, and that just, again, this is kind of showmanship. We talked a lot about just big picture, getting cattle, the kind of competition that we already talked about a few of those things. But, you know, questions, I get a lot of questions about what kind of questions are getting asked. You know, I don't ask questions personally, because I think there's other avenues to test that. As I always say, sometimes tongue in cheek, but, you know, when I've shown my age bull on the hill at Denver, nobody asked me how much he eats, and I certainly wouldn't show him with a pink stick. So when I'm judging showmanship, you know, that's not really my priority of putting them through the paces. But you know, questions should be like a skirt, long enough to cover it. Answers the questions like a skirt, long enough to cover everything, short enough to keep the subject interesting. You should have enough information to provide a judge, you know, if it's about what's good or bad about your calf, how much are they eating. That you know, it's not just 2 coffee cans of feed out of the purple and pink bag. It's, you know, 3 pounds twice a day. It's 12% ration, mostly oats, corn, some cottonseed. It shows an understanding without going on for a long time. Or what would you change about your calf? On that bull I showed you earlier, I'd like to fix him in his hip, but I think that's because he's really got an overwhelming amount of power and muscle that he's built like. You know, enough to answer the question, kind of keep things positive if it has more of a negative tone, but be succinct, be knowledgeable, and if you don't know, don't make anything up. But I do get asked a lot about what kind of questions will be asked, so that's kind of my response to that. And then finally, just, and I had the resources down there in terms of watching some game tape, but also selecting a calf to use. I also hear about specific to showmanship, you know, if you have multiple at a show, obviously you want to use your best dancing partner, but I'm kind of the school, like if we're at any level and it's tough all over anymore. Show them if you got them. If your best calf is also the one that shows the best, do everything you can to have a competitive advantage. I'm not a big proponent of saving them up. And granted, as a judge, it's not about judging the cattle and showmanship, but it's only going to enhance your ability to be seen, to kind of be that package, and oftentimes better cattle are a little bit easier to show too. So really, you're doing yourself a service. So use every competitive advantage that you have in terms of that regard. If you have a high quality animal that shows the best, I'd recommend you use that one. Anything specific to that, Miles? And I know we've been going at this for a while, but
No, it's going great. We have a lot of people, honestly. I think that, like I just said, you're answering questions. We continue, and so I'm not having to, but we just have a lot of people that are very appreciative right now of kind of where you guys are. But I think as far as, being any more specific, if they haven't learned, or if you haven't learned anything tonight, I'm not sure that within any of the webinars that you will. And there's a lot to take in. Emily is a very, very, very knowledgeable stock person. And there's a lot to take in, but those things that she talked about are not minute. They're very, very important. And so, that is kind of where we're at. What about yourself, Emily? As you kind of come, to where we are here in the slides and this evening, what is anything else, that these kids need to know, these families, as they continue to move forward as their first years or their 10-year 4-H members?
A few things. The biggest thing I can say is, you're already well ahead of your peers by being receptive to this kind of content. And, it's so great that Show-Rite is doing, and, you can really learn a lot, start to finish, in terms of what they're putting together. And that's the best thing that you can do is ask questions. And certainly just don't ask them of me, or just ask them of Miles, but anybody that you see, certainly anybody that's been on any of these webinars across the species, ask questions. We wouldn't do this if we didn't want to try to help out young people, try to encourage participation in the project. And it is a lot to take in, and in no way is it, we could literally, and we do, spend a junior show career or a lifetime and not learn everything. But the only way that you're going to continue to ask those questions, and these people that you see, whether it's a question via social media, which I welcome. Ask me anything, because things will come up, and I'll always be available, or at a show. And I think I could speak to a lot of people. Again, we're all in this together. We're committed to making everybody successful. That's what this platform does. That's what people that are showing, breeding, feeding cattle. We talk rising tide lifts all ships. We want you to do good. We want you to be successful. So ask those questions in any avenue that you can, and ask them of a wide range of people. And the other thing that I'll tell you too is, I don't think it's a bad thing to maybe identify a few people. It doesn't matter what level they're on, if they're within your county or they're on a more national level. Hopefully you feel comfortable going up and talking to them, and they're going to be personal back. But if not, it's not bad to have a mentor. Have somebody that you want to be like, and learn what they do. And if every judge doesn't like what you do, that's okay. But they'll be happy with how you're getting your cattle presented. And that person that you say, I really want to aspire to be like, it's okay to find some of those people and to really follow them and hone in, and just use all the resources that you can. Because again, we could never be comprehensive tonight, but just don't ever be afraid to ask. And you guys are already well ahead of your peers, whether they know nothing or think they know everything. Just continuing to get more information. If not, you'll come to kind of a median understanding. Something in the middle, maybe just your speed. But so yeah, reach out, and Miles, I don't know if you have anything to add with that, but I'm sure he'd be happy to answer questions.
Yeah, we've got a few of them, but pretty well the questions are done. We just have a lot of folks that are thanking you, Emily. I know that you for sure are now a role model, at least one young lady tonight. Lily Johnson said she wants to be like you. And so that's cool. And this is exactly why we're doing what we're doing, is for things like that. And so, as we come to a close, which I believe we are, is that correct? As we're on this final slide. Can't thank Emily just enough for being a part of this tonight. And, like she said, lots of information, but these are things that we could literally sit down and do for a camp on a weekend and talk about everything that she just did within the few short hours that she did. And you can tell the passion, and we sure appreciate her being a part of this tonight. Those of you that have tuned in and stayed with us this entire time as well, we appreciate you so much. And, obviously tell your peers, your friends, family members, what have you, that these episodes, these webinars are available at Show-Rite.com. You just go right to our scroll log, scroll list there, and you'll be able to see on the left-hand side or anywhere on the screen that comes up, that the Stock Show Classroom, and you can open them up. I believe we're on maybe week 8, maybe week 7. We're somewhere 7, 8, 9, something like that right now. And so to think that we've been doing these for almost 2 months is absolutely crazy, but we've enjoyed it and made a lot of friends via these programs. So Emily, thanks so much for tuning in. And those of you that do have any questions, I'll answer just a few of them here as we end, and then feel free. Emily's spectacular, a great friend, like I said, and so happy that she got to be on here tonight. She'll answer anything that you have, and I will as well. But we appreciate all of you tuning in. Thank you, and good luck this summer as you continue. Don't give up. Keep working on them.
Thanks, everyone.